Lost Blades by Liz Sauco. Narrated by Jesstin Jacobs. Chapter 1. Hey, look at me! A voice cut through the surrounding haze where nothing else had. He tried to focus on it. Come on, you can do it. He was trying, but he couldn't focus on the voice long enough to figure out where the sound was coming from. Damn, they hit you pretty badly, huh? He couldn't even lift his head from where it rested on his chest, a position he wasn't entirely sure how he had gotten into. He thought he heard a sigh. Look at me. A musical ring, almost like bells echoing, entered the voice, and he felt compelled to lift his head until he met violet eyes. Ah, that's it. Immediately, his head cleared and most of the pain faded, allowing him to focus on where he was. He appeared to be in a cage with dark metal bars and harsh lighting. It was just big enough for him, a small lumpy cot, and a waste disposal unit. The room holding the cage was gray and bare. It had only one door with a sophisticated electronic lock and no windows. Wonderful. He was in jail. There were 7 other cages in the room, but only the one across from him was occupied. An Avari woman with long white hair tied up in a ponytail and curious violet eyes had somehow hooked her legs through the bars that crossed the top of her cage and was hanging upside down, long ears twitching happily. Her all-black clothing fit tightly to her body. It looked nothing like any of the local fashions. There were no guards in sight. Then again, he was in the middle of a security station in the heart of the Empire. Of course, they would have only the latest technology to keep lawbreakers in their nice, cozy cages. No extra guards were required. Every move they made was most likely being monitored and watched carefully for any hint of escape. Probably by more tech programmed to look for such things, so no one would have to do such a dull and boring job. She waved at him. He stared at the woman blankly, unsure what to make of her. She was looking at him intently, but the effect was somewhat diminished by her position. She looked ridiculous. Then she smiled, ears perking up happily as she saw that she had his attention. "Welcome back to the land of the living," she said cheerfully. "Seems like they really don't like you, the way they just threw you in there like a sack of bricks. Are you feeling any better now?" He ignored her, feeling his own ears drop slightly in annoyance, and brought a hand up to rub his eyes. He was not feeling quite up to speaking yet, and especially not with some weird person hanging upside down in a jail cell. He felt a sudden spike of panic, and his hand darted down to his ankle. He touched metal and sucked in a breath in relief. His key was still tied there. The woman seemed to take his movement as an affirmative and began to swing herself from side to side silently for a few minutes as he tried to get the last of his headache to go away. "So, what are you in here for?" she asked finally, interest clear in her voice. He raised his eyebrows and sighed, shaking his head and letting his gaze sweep over the room again, not that there was much to look at. He didn't feel up to dealing with eccentric strangers right now. He shivered as a cold draft worked its way by him. His coat was gone. His new, warm, comfy gray coat. It was probably considered evidence for the stolen chips, he figured glumly. Or they had wanted to make him suffer a little. Either option was a possibility. He sighed and picked himself up off the floor to sit on the cot. It felt even lumpier than it looked, but it was better than the floor. At least everything was dry and looked clean. That was even an improvement over his normal living arrangements, where filth was practically a method of interior decorating and the weather affected the inside of structures only marginally less than the outside. Even the fabric covering the cot was of a higher quality than he was used to. "Well?" He looked over at his chatty neighbor in annoyance, realizing that she was still waiting for an answer. Part of him wondered absently if she just didn't like silence. "Do you really want to know?" His voice was a little rough, but at least it didn't waver or slur. Better than he had hoped for after such a hit to the head. For that matter, he was surprised that his short ponytail was still mostly in place, just a few ruby-colored strands escaping their tie. Her eyes widened, violet meeting silver, and she nodded earnestly at him. He sighed again and cast his thoughts back to earlier in the day before everything had gone to hell. Watch it! My apologies, miss. The young waiter sidestepped out of the woman's way, barely missing the embroidered hem of her floor-length red gown. He took a moment to steady the drinks on his tray before continuing to thread his way through the crowd of gamblers and eye candy a little more carefully, pausing every so often to allow one of the patrons to take a full glass or place down an empty one before moving on. There were many men and women here like the one in the red dress. Only the truly rich and influential were invited to the annual party at the Silver Ring Casino, and the truly rich of the empire were generally also the truly snobbish. It did not matter that he had not actually made contact with the woman in any way, only that she had perceived the possibility that something that was supposed to be a background object had intruded on her personal space and impeded her graceful movements. Or perhaps it had been his dark red hair that had alarmed her, just a few shades too red to be human, or the pointed ears that marked him as Avari. He didn't think she'd gotten a good look at his eyes, but the silver definitely would have given him away. Humans were always wary around the Avari these days, and such interactions were common between the two races. He supposed it was possible that she simply hadn't expected to see an Avari at such a high-class party, but the kitchen had been understaffed for the event. A few Avari had been hired to help the regular human workers take care of the guests, and he had joined the unfamiliar faces tonight so that he could carry out his plan. When his tray was filled with empty glasses, he made his way back to the kitchen, nodding to the security guard on the way in and ignoring the beep. Dropping the tray on a nearby counter, he quickly moved through the noise and activity until he came to a door in the back. He glanced around to make sure no one was watching as he entered the deserted room, where the help changed into the provided uniforms. Approaching the place where he'd left his regular clothing, he pulled a handful of casino chips out from his pocket and hid them with the small stash that he had previously gathered. He made sure they were out of sight again before he returned to the kitchen to pick up another tray of glasses and return to the party. Casinos such as the Silver Ring still used a chip system on the floor instead of the universal credit system that reigned outside. While credit provided the government with a clear record of purchases and sales, the chips themselves were untraceable and worth a lot of money, and thus could be sold for untraceable paper cash on the black market. Cash could only be used on the black market, but having the resources to get food for a few months was worth the risk to get it. And there was risk. Though the chips were untraceable in an attempt to keep them as vintage as possible, the casinos did have security measures in place to keep them within their buildings. All doors leading from the floor had sensors that would beep and flash red if chips passed through them. Guards were stationed next to each sensor, and any offender was quickly escorted back to the exchange terminal. However, though there was a sensor and a guard next to the door to the kitchen, the rules were a little different for the servers. Since they got tipped for making special trips for guests, the sensor went off nearly every time they went through. The management did not want their employees to waste time exchanging their chips every single time they got tipped, so as long as the sensor didn't flash red on their way through at the end of their shift, it was ignored. He was using this to his advantage, carefully relieving the patrons of a few chips here and there and leaving them with his clothing. He was careful to bring a few back with him so the sensor would trigger on his way onto the floor, ensuring the guard wouldn't know he was leaving them in the back. This surprisingly simple plan would allow him to sell the chips on the black market later. He already had a dealer in mind who would more than appreciate the chips and pay him well. The last few years had been difficult, and he'd been barely scraping by. He just wanted to be able to buy food. He didn't want to have to steal or to worry about where his next meal was coming from or if it was even coming at all. All he had to do was put up with a few rich, snobby, bigoted humans for a few hours. He had noticed the event 2 years ago as he had been wandering through the city. He hadn't paid it any mind at the time, but it wasn't long before he began to wonder how hard it would be to steal from the casino guests. They were very wealthy, Surely they could stand to lose a little money that would go to a better cause. Over the course of the next few days, the idea had kept coming back, until he finally considered looking into it. He began researching both the casino and the event, eventually deciding to observe the next party the casino held and hit the one after that. It had been a lot of work and a long build-up requiring patience and dedication, but now it was all paying off. He could not have hoped for things to be going any more smoothly. He skillfully weaved through the crowd with his tray, offering drinks as he went. Most of the conversation around him concerned the sentencing of Lady Hotaru's murderer, which was scheduled to happen within the next few days in the Ni Fon province. People seemed pretty split on whether the punishment would be death or banishment. Would the emperor himself do the sentencing? Lady Hotaru had been the daughter of one of the 7 provincial dukes, but Ni Fon was far, and the emperor rarely left a gale. He had heard a wide variety of stories surrounding the lady's death over the past 8 months, and even the Avari found themselves gossiping about it. He himself did not overtly care about the court drama of the human nobles who ran the empire, but there were many others who did. He did find it interesting that the killer had been a human and Hotaru's fiancée, but at least that made it not an Avari problem. He had already amassed quite a few chips, and he was planning on making 2 or 3 more runs before leaving. He had slowed his intake to decrease the chances of getting caught, and now he was gearing up for the final part of the plan: escape. "Excuse me?" He blinked, ears perking up, surprised anyone would directly address him in a non-negative fashion, and turned around to see a blonde human in a sparkly, skimpy white dress blinking large blue eyes at him. He immediately offered her the tray, thinking that she might simply want a drink, but she didn't so much as glance at it. Her eyes gained a predatory gleam and her smile widened. Something about that set off an alarm in his head. He suddenly felt very uncomfortable, his ears dropping. She moved closer, then followed him when he took a hasty step back. "I'm thirsty for something else, lovely." "Oh, your eyes. So pretty. Silver is such a lovely color. And it goes so well with your hair. What's your name?" she cooed, reaching out as though to touch him. He was sure that under other circumstances this would be funny, considering she looked to be about 4 years younger than him, maybe 17 or 18, but he couldn't find it in himself to be amused. Instead, he felt vaguely sick and took another step back. He tried not to think about how Avari often disappeared when they gained these sorts of attentions from humans. It was illegal, but such trafficking did occur, especially among the rich. Why was this happening now? Waiter? The girl's smile slipped from her face as she looked at something over his shoulder. He stepped to the side to keep her in his line of sight and immediately saw the issue. A tall human woman with intricately pinned up white hair, or was it pale blonde? She looked too young to have naturally white hair, stood a few feet behind him. Her gown was such a dark green that it was nearly black, and had what looked like diamonds sparkling at the edges. A net veil covered the top half of her face, but he could still make out the sharp green eyes pinning him in place. Everything about her screamed power and wealth. "I would like a turmoil martini," she continued, seeing that she had his attention. "Fetch one for me." He bowed immediately, hiding his relief as he sensed an escape from the blonde. Of course, miss," he murmured, careful to speak at a proper volume. "It will be a moment." He started to move away. But before he was able to take more than a step, the blonde grabbed his arm. "Go find another one," she snapped, just barely civil. "This one's busy." The pale-haired woman tilted her head ever so slightly to the side, taking in the situation. "Indeed, he's busy getting me my drink. I would appreciate it if you would allow him to do so." She leveled a pointed gaze at the blonde's grip on his arm. "No, he is not. I asked for his help, and he was just about to come with me." She looked at the now petrified thief and managed a sweet smile. "Were you not?" she asked almost kindly. looking at him hopefully. It was disturbing, and the sick feeling intensified as his stomach dropped. "This is not an auction or a store for you to shop at, Ms. Kierson. Do I have to remind you that he works here? He's not here for your entertainment, but to get the rest of us what we ask for." The smile disappeared as the blonde snapped her gaze back to the woman. "He's mine," she hissed, refusing to give up. "When I tell my father—" "Yes, let us tell your father," the pale-haired woman interrupted. "You are making a scene which I'm sure he will appreciate, and I also think that he'll be very interested in the Galleon apples, don't you?" The woman's voice was cold as she gazed at the girl, who paled, then flushed, then paled again. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out, leaving her looking rather like a fish searching for food. Her shock was palpable, and he could see it warring with the livid anger on her face. The woman's dark red lips turned up ever so slightly into a smile. "I didn't think so." It was pretty clear to the thief who had won this battle. The blonde managed to pull herself together long enough to shoot a vicious glare at the woman. She snatched her hand away from him, turned on her heel, and stormed away without looking back. He barely managed to refrain from a sigh of relief. Saved. But then the woman turned her sharp gaze on him, pinning the thief in place before he could escape to the safety of the kitchen. She surprised him, though, when her gaze softened by a fraction. "Now would be a good time for you to leave," she suggested coolly. "That girl is very possessive, and you do not want to end up as one of her playthings. Forget about the drink." Her gaze lingered on him for just a moment more, then she stepped back into the crowd and was gone almost immediately. The thief stood there, frozen in shock for several long moments. Saved by a human! But whatever her reason, she had given sound advice. He didn't trust the blonde to continue to leave him alone once she noticed that the other woman had left. It was definitely time to go. He had stolen more than enough to last him for quite some time anyway. He quickly moved off to the side of the room, and after checking to make sure no one was looking, he dropped all the chips he had on him into the massively leafy branches of a convenient potted plant. He then put the last 2 drinks on his tray onto a nearby end table and headed back towards the kitchen. When he reached the guard, he stopped. "This was my last trip," he informed the man, who nodded silently as he passed through the sensor. The light flashed green, and the guard waved him towards the kitchen. He dropped his tray on the nearest counter and headed back to the changing room. Luckily, no one else was there, and within a few minutes he had changed back into his normal clothing, with his precious cargo stowed in various pockets throughout his coat. He stuffed the uniform in a nearby locker and darted out the door towards freedom. He smiled as the back door to the silver ring closed behind him, leaving him in a side alley. He had actually done it. He had succeeded in stealing from one of the most prestigious casinos in the entire city of Lyndiniam. No, the entire province of Agale. The very heart of the empire. He was going to be rich. His mood improving considerably from the nauseating encounter with the blonde girl, he strolled out of the alley onto the main street and emerged into the bustling nightlife. Buildings made of white luster and glass climbed in clean, straight lines all around him. Here, in the center of the empire, everything was made to be sleek, ageless, and modern. Greenery was carefully controlled. The streets were smooth, paved with a modified silvery gray luster. The casino was the one building that stood out. In another attempt to be more traditional, the giant doors were framed in a dark gray stone, with flourishes and decorations etched into it. Despite the late hour, the streets were crowded with people as they went along to their destinations, talking and laughing to one another as they went. Officers of the city guard stood at attention at their posts in sharp black and gray uniforms, keeping a watchful eye on the populace, ready to act at the first sign of trouble. It was nothing like the part of the city he hailed from, where Avari had to make do with whatever scraps they could get and crime ran rampant. The cool autumn wind blew by him as he started down the street. The weather had only just started to change, but it would be cold soon enough. Winter was always difficult when you lived in buildings that were open to the elements and didn't retain heat, But this year, he now had enough money to spend the cold season comfortably. His winter coat was another new thing this year. It was plain, but warm. A good steal. All in all, he was looking forward to a good winter. As he approached the front of the silver ring, he could hear what sounded like crying coming from within the building. The giant doors were open, and as he passed by, he glanced into the lobby. He blinked in surprise as he saw the blonde girl from earlier with her white dress torn and her hair a mess. She was sobbing as she talked to several guard officers, one of which had a digital pad and stylus in hand and looked to be taking notes. Then she looked past the officer and locked eyes with him. She screamed, backing up and pointing one damning finger at him. The thief didn't know what exactly she had told them, but he could bet it wasn't good, and there was absolutely no one who would take an Avari's word over that of a rich, young, female human. They wouldn't even bother asking questions. He would have no chance. So he turned and ran, straight into two members of the guard. Luck was with him. They seemed surprised to have the blonde screaming and pointing in their direction. He dropped and spun, kicking his leg out to sweep the closer officer's legs out from beneath him. In the background, he heard a voice yell, "Stop him!" And he knew he had no time to get into a brawl. The other officer didn't react quickly enough, and a strong elbow to the stomach cleared an escape route, but that was when his luck ran out. The other officers had gotten close enough to join the fight, and one flying tackle landed him on the ground with the breath knocked out of him and an officer on top of him. He tried to twist and kick free, but couldn't break the officer's grip. Sudden pain blossomed in his head and stars appeared as the officer slammed his head down into the ground, momentarily stunning him. This was all the opportunity the officers needed to subdue him long enough to cuff his hands behind him. He was roughly hauled up off the ground and slammed against the hood of a nearby guard vehicle. His cheek was pressed against the hard material, and he moved just a little to rest his aching head against the cool surface. He could still hear the girl screaming in the background. "It was him!" she shrieked, over and over again. He wished she would stop as he tried to focus on what was going on around the pounding in his head. He was already being arrested. What more did she want? He felt the officer's hands begin to search him, then freeze when they encountered one of the many pockets full of stolen casino chips. Not only was luck no longer helping him, but she seemed to be cheering for the other side as the officer pulled out a handful of black and silver chips. The thief heard the officer's sharp intake of breath. Briefly, he entertained the idea that the guard would let go of him in shock, but if anything, the hold on him tightened. An assailant and a thief, the guard spat in disgust. That really didn't seem quite right to him as he tried to fight the disorientation that was steadily getting worse. He hadn't attacked any... Oh. He should have figured that the blonde bitch would have told them something like that. "What else do you expect from an Avari?" he heard another officer snort. "It's not like they know how to behave." He reflected in a somewhat detached fashion that he was never going to see the light of day again as he felt himself being manhandled into the vehicle. He was starting to feel increasingly dizzy as he watched the lights of the city pass by in an incomprehensible blur as they drove to one of the security stations located in the city. By the time they arrived, he had to be pulled from the vehicle and dragged into the building, as the dizziness and disorientation had increased to the point where he had to focus completely on staying awake. If he fell asleep now, he had a feeling he wouldn't be waking up again. He couldn't pay any attention to what was going on around him, where he was going, or what was happening to him. Distantly, he felt himself hit a hard surface, which knocked the breath out of him again. "Hey, look at me!" Well, why not? I assaulted someone and stole millions from a casino. The woman blinked, looking almost confused and a little disappointed as her ears drooped a bit. She eyed him for a moment, then raised an eyebrow skeptically. He shrugged and decided not to explain any further. "How did you get in here then?" he asked. She smiled, ears perking up. "I walked." He opened his mouth to clarify, then shut it. He wondered if she was insane and if he should be questioning his own sanity for expecting a straight answer out of someone who had been hanging upside down for an indeterminate period of time. "This isn't the main jail," he said instead, changing the subject and giving the room another look. "No, it's not. You were arrested after admissions closed for the night, so we're just an Officer HQ security station until the morning." She began to swing herself slightly from side to side again. Then he realized that his headache was not just better, but gone. Completely. Which was strange, as he was pretty sure that he had had a concussion. His memory was still rather fuzzy, but he could remember seeing violet eyes, and there was only one other person around. "What did you do?" he asked suddenly, shifting to look at her. She gave him a puzzled look. "I walked." "I had a concussion," he clarified. "But now I feel a lot better. And that doesn't seem possible unless you did something." "What?" She smiled and shrugged, which looked odd given her position. "Oh, that. Magic." He stared at her. Crazy was sounding like a better and better explanation. "Magic doesn't exist anymore," he reminded her slowly, wondering at the same time why he was even bothering. "Do your concussions often heal themselves?" she asked curiously. "What? No." She cut him off with a happy grin. "Of course not. Concussions don't do that. So the answer is obviously magic. Unless you have a better explanation." He was flabbergasted. Why was magic more likely than a self-healing concussion? He shrugged, groping for a better answer. "New technology?" She gave him an amused look. "If you say so." Silence fell between them for a minute or two. Maybe he had actually guessed right, since she hadn't tried to argue the point. It certainly made more sense than magic. Still, he wondered what type of tech could fix a concussion from over 10 feet away. "So, what is your name?" she asked suddenly. He paused. "Jamirh," he finally offered. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he thought he saw something dark flash in them. But it was gone so quickly he wasn't sure he had seen it at all. "I did not ask what you are called. I asked what your name is." Something in her voice changed, echoed. He stared at her, bemused. She stared back. "My name is Jamirh," he finally said, ears lowering slightly. He didn't know what she was going on about, but this was ridiculous. He'd answered her. Did she have to pry further? She frowned slightly, her own ears drooping unhappily. "Stronger this time, but whatever. I suppose you can call me Hell, then." She was an all-around strange, annoying, invasive, insane person, and he tried to stop himself. But in the end, he had to ask. "What kind of name is Hell?" She smiled. "A very, very old one. Now, I strongly suggest you try to get some sleep. We have a big day tomorrow." "What?" He was cut off by a dull buzzing sound emanating from the other side of the door as the lights went out, leaving them in total darkness. Not even the emergency lights remained lit. "Well, would you look at that?" He couldn't see her, but he just knew from the tone of her voice that she had a feral grin on her face. "It's tomorrow already." Chapter 2. "Well, I'm sorry you didn't get any sleep, but it's time to go." Hell sounded like she could barely contain her glee. Jamirh was trying very hard to control his temper. "What are you talking about? In case you haven't noticed, we are locked in metal cages." "No, we're not." He could hear the cheer in her voice. "Try the door." "I can't see the door," he snapped, rapidly losing ground in his internal battle to stay calm. A small ball of white light suddenly appeared over one of her hands, illuminating the room. Hell was grinning almost manically as she reached up to grab the bars she was hanging from so she could swing down. The little ball of light stayed where it was, hovering in place. "Can you see now?" she asked smugly as she calmly pushed open the door to her cage. Then she wobbled a bit, putting a hand to her head. Oh, okay, that feels weird. New feeling. Not good. He blinked and winced at the sudden brightness. Then he stared in surprise at the small flare, trying to reconcile it with logic and sense. Perhaps she was one of those experimental bionics that the government was supposedly producing? He didn't know what the cybernetic implants were and all that they entailed, but it could explain the mental instability if her mind had been unable to cope. It was possible that she had convinced herself that she could do magic if that were the case. He had seen similar delusions in others living on the streets who had suffered traumatizing events. He stood and walked the 2 steps to the door and pushed it, watching with some surprise as it opened. More of your magic? He asked dryly, deciding to humor her. She smiled at him. The light? Yes. The general power outage and other problems this building is suffering? No. We had outside help with that. She all but skipped over to the door, but then paused to eye Jamirh, who hadn't moved. Aren't you coming? She asked pleasantly. Surely you don't want to stay arrested? Jamirh briefly considered his options. On the one hand, he hadn't been conscious enough to take note of how to get out of the building by himself. Also, if Hel was bionic, as he had begun to suspect, she could prove useful in escape. On the other hand, Hel was clearly unhinged, and that unstable element could land them right back behind bars. Wander around by himself and risk recapture trying to find an exit, or rely on a crazy chick. He was so stuck between a rock and a hard place. And it was strange that the building had lost literally all power. Shouldn't buildings like security stations have a generator or something in the event of a power outage like this? And weren't emergency lights and systems made to be able to function despite power loss? Fine, he agreed. But once we're outside, we go our separate ways. Hel grinned triumphantly. Stay close. She brought the little light close to her lips as she reached out with her other hand to grab his. The woman hummed a few short, sorrowful notes, and the light flickered and died. Remember to be quiet or they'll find us, she whispered in a sing-song tone as she squeezed his hand. And don't let go. And then they were moving. Avari needed less light to see than humans, but they did need some light. He had no idea how Hel planned to find her way in the dark, but after the first few turns were made without crashing into walls, it was pretty clear that the lack of light was not going to be an issue. He considered as they traveled and decided that night vision was probably a pretty basic artificial enhancement. But nothing explained what Hel was doing in an overnight cell in Officer HQ. Suddenly, Jamirh tensed as he was yanked to one side and pressed against a wall. A hand covered his mouth, stifling his instinctive grunt of surprise. Shh, he heard Hel breathe in his ear. He nodded once to show he understood, and she removed her hand from his mouth as they both waited, listening. After a moment, he heard the sounds of someone farther down the corridor, stumbling around in the dark over the continued buzzing of the alarm, which had been getting louder as they progressed. Whoever it was did not seem to care about being heard. He was swearing and clearly having a difficult time in the dark. Maven, report! A sharp voice crackled over a transmitter, easily audible over the droning. It's pitch black down here, Captain. I am about halfway to the cells. I think, he added quietly. Whoever misplaced the glow lights is in for it. There was a slight pause, during which Jamirh heard the guard stumble and crash to the floor amid much more cursing. Jamirh could feel the amusement pouring off Hel as she began to quietly inch them away down the hall. Just make sure the cells are still locked. The woman's voice sounded oddly strained. Out. This is ridiculous, Maven snarled as they got farther away. Where would he go? Where indeed, Jamirh thought as they moved away. Soon they could no longer hear the unfortunate officer and were back to their original speed. Hel led him down several more hallways before a turn revealed a little pinprick of blue light indicating active tech of some sort a few feet away, barely revealing the fuzzy outline of a door. The lock was still active. Hel stopped short, allowing Jamirh to catch a glance at her face and the puzzled expression on it. Suddenly, her eyes narrowed as she strode forward to the door, steps just shy of stomps, and made several short, angry clicking sounds. The light cheerfully ignored her. Hel dropped to one knee so she was eye level with the light, still gripping his hand. Her hiss had just as little effect as the clicks, and her expression turned just short of livid. Jamirh had just enough time to wonder what she thought she was doing before she abruptly stood and dragged him several paces away from the door. The sound she made then was nothing like the clicks or the hiss. It was somewhere between a roar and a shriek. It was loud and piercing, and Jamirh swore at her as he tried to jerk away to cover his ears. 3 things then happened, all at the same time. The door exploded, all the lights came back on, alarms started to scream through the building. Jamirh felt partially deafened by the echo of the sound ringing in his ears as Hel looked at him sheepishly, her ears lowered slightly in embarrassment. "This may be time for speed rather than stealth. They'll have probably heard that and be on their way," she offered. He gaped at her, his ears practically flattening in rage. "The whole city probably heard that, and now they have power." She paused for a moment, considering. "I don't think I had anything to do with the power, and I do doubt that anyone outside the building heard me. Can we go now?" The question was hopeful as her ears perked up again. He stared at her. "Good." She began to pull him down the hallway. "This way." He reluctantly followed, having huge misgivings about going with her, but not having a choice in the matter. He consoled himself with the thought that they would be separating soon, whether or not they actually escaped. They began to run, but as they spun around a corner, chaos ensued as they crashed into a very surprised squad of officers who had been running in their direction. Shouts erupted all around. Jamirh slammed hard into one of them, then felt his arm scream in pain as Hel continued moving without releasing the vice-like grip on it. He stumbled after her as best he could through the confused tangle, breaking into a run when they somehow reached the other side. He could hear the officers shouting for backup on transmitters as they dashed away. They slid around another corner and burst through a door into the main lobby. Both officers and civilians were ignored as Jamirh and Hel jumped over a nearby desk, heading for the double glass doors. Suddenly, Hel pulled him sharply to the left and down, just before Jamirh heard shots ring out behind them. The little light to the right of the doors blinked from green to blue. Jamirh cringed, realizing that they were going to slam into reactive glass, but their momentum carried them through the first set before the chemical process could begin. Unfortunately, the second set was already turning from clear glass to a dull gray metal. Jamirh tried to stop, but Hel made that awful shrieking sound once more and pulled them through the resulting shards of what had been the door. Freedom. Hel paused, and Jamirh used the hesitation to break free from her grip before sprinting to the right through startled citizens and darting into the first alley he came across. He vaulted over a low wall and dashed across the next street and into another alley. Quickly scrambling up a pile of boxes leaning against the building to the roof, he glanced behind him. No Hel. Pursuit did not sound far behind, and he could see officers in the street below, but they did not seem to have noticed him ascend to the roofs and were pushing their way through the crowded street. Strange. He hadn't thought it would be that easy. Why hadn't they seen him enter the alley? They hadn't been that far behind. Perhaps they had followed Hel? He decided he wouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. He crossed several roofs before dropping into yet another alley. He entered the adjoining street at a brisk walk and was instantly hidden in the crowd. Just one more in a sea of faces. He shivered in the crisp air, again mourning the loss of his coat. He swiped a steaming hot beverage off a cafe table as he passed, its previous owner too busy digging around in her purse to notice. He took a sip. Coffee. Black. Acceptable, though he would have preferred it a little sweeter. Well, a lot sweeter. But this was fine. He savored the warmth as he made his way back to the Blackfields district. Here, the buildings were far, far older, and made of stone, brick, and steel instead of the safer and more uniform Leicester. Often they were falling apart due to their great age. The only thing that kept them standing was that the government didn't have the money or time to tear them down and replace them with new buildings for legitimate homes and businesses. This made them perfect for the illegitimate homes and businesses of the dregs of society, the vast majority of which were Avari. Whores, drug dealers, assassins, and thieves like himself, All lived and worked in this neglected section of Lyndiniam, the smear on the jewel of the empire. It was one of the few areas in the entire city where most Avari could afford to live, but everyone knew the government would wipe it out if they could. At least his ruby-colored hair and silver eyes actually blended in more here. A group of 4 Avari were lurking near the entrance to one of the more central squares in this section of Blackfields. An Avari with dark blue hair and green eyes whistled as Jamirh passed, elbowing one of his friends. "Hey, look who it is. How's it go?" "Shut up," Jamirh snapped, not in the mood to deal with their bullshit. He knew where this was going. He continued walking, avoiding the square itself. "Aw, come on," another Avari laughed. "Surely the great—" "Nope," Jamirh cut her off. "Go find someone else's night to ruin." Gods, but he missed Aether. He'd always known how to stop the badgering, had known when Jamirh just could not deal with it. He heard their laughter fade into the distance as he continued home. He refused to let himself dwell on it as he walked through the crumbling streets. Some of the houses on the edges of the district were still structurally sound, and some were even kind of nice and well kept, even if they were small and simple. But as Jamirh traveled deeper into Blackfields, the buildings became less sound, more decrepit. The lighting was hit or miss, but Jamirh had grown up here, and he knew his way around even in the dark. Some Avari called out to him as he passed, but he just answered with a wave and kept going. He continued through dim and narrow streets, avoiding trash, debris, and the occasional grasping hand. He wanted to collapse. He turned down another alley, hopping the wall of almost filled trash cans in the way and dropping the now empty coffee cup into one. Carefully picking his way to the back of the alley and avoiding the few traps he'd set up, he shifted the large, heavy board that covered the entrance to his little hole-in-the-wall home and slipped inside. He replaced the board and took 2 steps to the rope ladder hanging from a hole in the ceiling. He climbed up with the ease of long practice and pulled the ladder up behind him before sealing it up with another board. He turned on the glow lamp, glancing around to make sure everything was as it should be. The room was small and cramped, but mostly weatherproofed with the help of a number of blankets and boards Jamirh had acquired since finding this place. A pile of blankets made up his bed in one corner, and he had a small, cracked table and wobbly chair in the other. 3 beat-up paperbacks lay in a neat pile on the table, a recent find he'd been very excited to stumble across. He didn't dare keep food in here, but there were a few bottles of water stashed under the table. A few other personal items and clothes were scattered about. The space was as clean as he could manage, but stains and dirt were visible on every surface. Home. He flopped down on his bed, taking a moment to relish the feeling of no longer being vertical and the slightly scratchy feel of his blankets. Then he reached down and untied his key from around his ankle, rubbing the worn, smooth metal between his fingers. The familiar action was soothing, and he turned the glow lamp off. He closed his eyes, feeling the cord the key hung on drape across his knuckles. Then he slammed his fist down on the bed next to him. "Damn it," he snarled. "Damn it, damn it, damn it." He felt sick to his stomach. Everything about tonight had turned out terribly. He was now in a worse spot than where he had started. He had lost the chips and his new coat, wasting nearly 2 years of planning. This winter would be just as difficult as the last few. Maybe even more difficult. He had just escaped prison. Would they come looking for him? "Hey, it's not that bad." He startled, eyes snapping open at the sound of the familiar voice, to see Hel looking down at him, her white hair giving her away even in the dark room. Holy... How the hell did you get in here? He clutched the key tightly as he flung himself away from her, back pressing against the wall as his heart hammered in his chest. The worn metal pressed into his palm, grounding him. If she was bothered by his reaction, she didn't show it, calmly turning the glow lamp back on. "I followed you," she admitted easily from where she knelt next to the bed. "Why?" he all but wailed, pressing his fist to his chest, trying to calm his heartbeat. "How?" She blinked, taken aback. I wanted to help you? Look, maybe just take a minute to breathe, okay? I'm sorry I scared you. I swear I didn't mean to." Her ears sank. "I forget, sometimes." She trailed off. He sucked in a couple of breaths before glaring at her with all the venom he could muster. Why? He repeated. Well, you helped me escape. There was no way she'd needed him for that. But still, no. Why would I need your help? She shrugged. Just because? Also, that girl you supposedly attacked has put up quite a fuss. While I was enjoying the hospitality of the nice officers currently searching for us, they were discussing how her father has proclaimed that he will not rest until justice has been served. So, he raised an eyebrow, but his stomach sank. Her words echoed the direction his thoughts had been going right before she'd scared the living daylights out of him. He rubbed at his key again. Well, he's sort of a very powerful noble with the time, money, and connections to ensure that you are eventually tracked down. Who? The Duke of Agale, Stefan Belian. Jamirh paled. Shit. His night just kept getting worse. It figured that he would piss off one of the most important and powerful men in the country. Duke Belian governed the province of Agale, the wealthiest and most important province in the Empire, as it was the original country that the Empire had been born from. As the Duke of that province, Belian would have everything and anything he needed to hunt down one escaped Avari prisoner. Jamirh was also very lucky, however. Though he hadn't recognized her first name, both Kirsten Belian and her father were rumored to be cruel and sadistic to any Avari unlucky enough to fall into their clutches. With a shudder, he steered his thoughts away from what he had escaped earlier that night when the pale woman had saved him from Kirsten. Still, why did you follow me then? Seems to me it would be better to get away, he pointed out, slowly uncurling from his defensive position. She shrugged. I try not to abandon the unjustly accused. Also, like I said before, I can help you. Why? He asked bitterly. How? There won't be anywhere safe for me in the whole Empire. Hel nodded. Exactly. So you should leave the Empire. Jamirh stared at her. Are you crazy? Leave the Empire? And go where exactly? Somehow book passage off this continent when they control all the ports? Well, you wouldn't need to leave the continent per se. Technically, the true northern boundary of the Empire is the Warcross Wall, she corrected. He wondered just how deep her mental instability ran. You're suggesting I live in a desolate wasteland? There's nothing north of the wall. Nothing alive, anyway. Wrong, she grinned. Though that mindset does work to our advantage. She sat back on her heels. In reality, there's an entire country north of the wall. One that the Empire can't assimilate, so you'll be safe. I have family up there. There are some of our people down here who help people in danger cross the wall. She paused, considering. You definitely qualify, if you were wondering. Clearly, the instability ran very deep. How can the Empire, a government that controls nearly all of the world's population, have missed an entire country that shares one of their borders? She smiled, not unkindly. Oh, they know about it at the highest levels. It's just that it's easier to pretend it doesn't exist, since they can't interact with it. And as for how Romanii keeps itself separate, the answer is, of course, magic. Jamirh opened his mouth to reply, stopped, and shut it again. He took a deep breath and counted to 10. Then he counted to 10 again, and continued on to 20 for good measure. Why was he prolonging this conversation? Oh, right. Because she was in his home. Somehow. The Empire built the wall to keep the plague that wiped out the Gini from traveling south and wiping out the humans and Avari. Though I suppose there was the added benefit of keeping the remaining vampires out. She blinked. Where did you hear that? School. You went to school? She looked surprised. It's mandatory for all children ages 5 to 15 to attend school in the mornings. He winced at the memory. The Empire wants to be able to say that everyone has at least basic schooling, so the public schools are all free. Well, yes, but you actually went. A free breakfast. Fascinating. She thought about that for a moment. We didn't know about the free food, but I guess it's too much to ask if they would actually teach you real history and feed you. I suppose we should just be thankful that they teach reading and writing. Taken aback, Jamirh stared at her. What does that mean? 1. The Guinea have not been wiped out by a plague, nor has that ever been a worry. 2. A wall is a bad choice of barrier when the Guinea are concerned, considering they have 6 wings and can fly. They just don't want anything to do with the Empire. And 3. The Empire did not build the wall. The short version is that when Romanii saw how the Empire was consuming everything around it, 9 of their mages offered their lives to their mother goddess, and she shaped their power into the wall. That's what keeps Romanii safe and hidden from prying eyes. She shrugged. More or less, anyway. You are not a Guinea, he stated flatly. Hell laughed. No. The Guinea live in the mountains. Romanii is between them and the wall. Well, kind of around them, actually. Jamirh shook his head. You are so crazy. Well, you don't know me, she agreed. But your choices right now are either to wait to become a human's plaything, or trust the crazy lady and maybe have a chance of getting out of this in one piece. She looked around at the room. They'll find this place eventually. There's nowhere in Lyndiniam that'll be safe. He didn't respond, knowing and hating the fact that she was right. But this was all he had ever known. Leave? How could he? How could he not? I'm sorry, she said quietly. I know I ask a lot from you, but you aren't safe here. And no one here is safe while you remain. That point was unfortunately good. The police wouldn't hesitate to ransack Avari areas if they felt like they had a good enough reason. Raids did happen in Blackfields. He considered her. It was still far more likely that she was a rogue bionic with a dangerous mental instability than a something from an invisible country. That idea was ridiculous. But where did that leave him? Was it better to follow her than not, if only because he had seen that she had abilities that could come in handy later? Then again, that could work to his advantage. If she put all her abilities towards getting him out of the Empire, did it really matter where they went? Or what she thought about where they were going, or why she was doing it? As long as he was safely away, who cared that she had created a whole country and alternate history in her mind? Once he was out of Belian's reach, he could figure out what he was going to do from there. He just had to find a way to avoid the danger of her delusions. But that meant leaving his home. His fist tightened around the key. He could become a hermit. Actually, that was looking like a really good idea right about now. Though if Hell's insanity was catching, he was going to be a crazy hermit. That was still preferable to being dead. Or worse. He thought back to the other Avari he had passed on the way back. Without Aether to be a buffer, the callouts and harassment had been getting worse. Maybe he should leave. Start over again somewhere else. It would be hard, sure, but would it be any worse than where he was now? Jamirh? Yeah, that was what he wanted. He closed his eyes, hugging the key tightly to his chest for a moment, before pulling the cord over his head. He slid the key under his shirt to rest against his chest. He glanced around regretfully, but he really didn't have anything else worth taking. He'd lost everything he might have wanted 2 years ago. All right, he agreed. Let's go. Her face lit up as her ears twitched happily. He glanced at the still covered hole to the exit. How did you get in here, though? She followed his gaze and shrugged. Magic. How convenient. He frowned, but then he decided this was also some sort of bionic enhancement, even if he didn't understand what it could even be. They descended quickly, and Jamirh disabled the traps just outside. Someone else would find this place, and maybe they'd be better off for it. This way, Hell declared, and off they went. They passed through the decrepit streets of his home quietly, avoiding people wherever possible. It was late enough now that most people were hidden away in their homes, or what passed for them. As they passed through an old market square, one that he normally would have avoided, Hell stopped to look at a pile of stones on the ground. Is this marble? She asked, poking at it with her foot. Jamirh shrugged. The old palace used to be somewhere around here, I think. from when the Empire was still called the Rose Empire. Hel frowned. Didn't there used to be some very impressive statues of Ebron Stormlight nearby? Her eyes traveled to an old plinth that had been shoved off to the side, engraved words made illegible by weather and age. He shrugged again, looking away. I have no idea. For all I know, you're looking at one right now. He waved a hand at the stones at her feet. Why would you want to see a statue of him anyway? He asked bitterly. She looked at him, confused. Because he was the hero. The hero, he spat, who brought the Empire to power so that the Avari could become second-class citizens. Hel favored him with a dry look. He was Avari. The queen he served was Avari. The Empire was still ruled by Avari several hundred years after his death. Without him, the Empire would not have existed, and Avari would be free from humans. Everything we suffer is because of him, he snapped back. Hel's look turned troubled. That's not necessarily true. Is that something you learned in school? Jamirh snorted. Nope. Personal opinion. But then, he was getting fed up with the whole conversation. It's obvious that sirens suddenly split the air, cutting Jamirh off and sounding an awful lot closer than he was perfectly comfortable with. Shit. They had locked down the city. At the very least, I would suggest getting out of Lyndiniam, Hel offered. Soon. Fine, he snapped again. Every road in and out of the city is blocked off by now, so how are we going to do that? She shrugged. I don't know. Jamirh couldn't stop himself from gaping at her. You don't know? How are you planning on getting out in the first place? I didn't exactly have an escape plan, she admitted, giving him a lopsided grin. Jamirh took a deep breath to keep from strangling her. Then he had an idea. This way. He took off at a run, Hel sprinting after him. He led her deeper into the maze of black fields. As they ran, he noticed that the few inhabitants who had been out were now nowhere to be seen, having already fled for safer places. As they wound through the streets, Jamirh tried to pick routes that would lead them farther from the alarms. Finally, they came to a small building that was partially caved in, with 2 gaping holes in its walls. Hel followed him closely as he moved to a small grate near the back. They haven't filled in the old sewer system yet? Hel asked curiously, ears twitching. They tried, Jamirh replied, kneeling down to start work on the grate. Most of the tunnels are filled in, but a few were overlooked. He wrenched the grate off and then turned to Hel. It'll be a tight fit. She nodded. Let's go. He motioned for her to go first. It's a bit of a drop, and you'll need to angle a bit to the right to land on the ledge, he warned, sweeping his eyes out over the street. The sirens were getting closer. He waited a moment for her to squeeze herself through and drop to the ledge before beginning the process himself, holding on to the grate. As he fell through, the grate caught back in its original position, and he swung himself over to the ledge. He carefully felt around for the electric glow he had hidden here previously, and switched it on to see Hel just a few feet away, shielding her eyes from the sudden brightness. He held his finger to his lips to indicate silence, then grabbed her wrist as he shut off the glow and started to head down the sewer. He had noted before that both light and sound carried in these tunnels, and he had no wish to be found. They walked for several hours, Jamirh turning on the glow every so often to check where they were. Every once in a while they could hear the sounds of sirens from up above, echoing through the tunnels, but that was the only sign of pursuit. They moved silently and quickly, until they started to see pale but natural light filtering in from a turn up ahead. They hurried towards it and rounded the bend, immediately seeing the large opening to the outside, blocked off by thick, vertical iron bars. He realized it was just before dawn. Jamirh pulled on the bars, but though they were rusted, they were firmly embedded in the old concrete and did not budge. "Can you screech at them?" he asked Hel, who had stopped a few feet back. "Not if I want to avoid coughing up blood for the next week or so. I'm pushing it doing it twice in one day. But don't worry, we won't need that." She stared at the bars for a few moments before gesturing one hand in a small circle just in front of the iron. Violet light followed, forming some sort of complicated circular symbol as she touched the bars carefully. The light from the symbol shattered into bright motes of glitter-like light, which disappeared when they touched the bars. Hel stared at it critically for another moment before turning to Jamirh. "Kick it really, really hard, please." He shook his head, trying to figure out if whatever she had just done was the same as the light from the cell or something different. "I'd rather not break my foot if it's all the same to you." She smiled. "You won't, I promise." He thought about it, but only for a moment. A breeze drifted into the tunnel, causing the leaves to rustle invitingly on the other side of the bars. He had never much thought about what was beyond Lyndiniam, but suddenly he wanted nothing more than to find out. He placed a hand over his key. Maybe it was time. His foot slammed through the metal as though it were made of brittle glass. Hel eyed the destruction approvingly as she began to move the foliage aside. "What did you do to the bars?" Jamirh asked in confusion. He had not truly expected anything to happen. He had kicked out more on a whim than anything else. She hesitated. "It's hard to explain. The metal was already old, past its intended period of use. It was rusted and not maintained. It probably would have fallen apart on its own in about 50 years or so. Inevitable, really. So I sort of hastened the inevitable by removing what life remained in the metal, which made it brittle. So it was like you kicked metal that was much, much older than it actually was. Does that make sense?" He just sighed. Back to the magic delusions. Metal doesn't have life. The look she gave him was almost affronted. "Of course it does. Everything has life of some sort." He shook his head. "Metal is metal. It doesn't think, it doesn't live. Though, just out of curiosity, when you say magic, do you actually mean very sophisticated tech that I don't want to explain to you because you won't understand?" Hel cocked her head to the side. "Magic is magic. Tech is tech. I can't work tech. It tends to end badly. Sort of like that first door we ran into in the security station." She shuddered. "Yeah, let's never mention that again, actually." What was wrong with this woman? She actually seemed to believe this. He still didn't. He just shrugged, giving up. "Fine, whatever." Hel smiled a little sadly at him and turned away. "We should get moving. We have a lot of ground to cover in a short period of time." She grinned back at him wryly. "And I can't wait to see how you handle Romanii." Chapter 3. Jamirh was already tired of walking. Hel set a brutal pace, declaring that the farther they got before they stopped, the better off they would be. The sewer had spat them out in the suburbs making up the northern part of Lyndiniam. They avoided streets as best they could, slipping through yards and the occasional park. The early hour luckily meant very few people were out and about, and Hel and Jamirh made sure to avoid anything or anyone that could mean detection. Hel was far better at sneaking than Jamirh would have thought. For all that her personality was loud, she slipped in and out of shadows in complete silence as though born to them. Jamirh, who had been playing such games of hide-and-seek with the authorities for most of his life, found himself impressed. She seemed to have an eerie ability to know where sirens would pop up, changing their course to avoid them often before Jamirh could hear them. Maybe her hearing had also been augmented? Eventually, civilization began to give way to nature. Fields of wildflowers and hay dotted with trees dominated the landscape, and if nothing else, it meant that it was easy to avoid the roads. Then they walked through more fields. And more fields. The life of a fugitive had so far proved to be extremely boring. At this point, Jamirh had begun to wonder if the entire world outside Lyndiniam was just the same 3 or 4 fields, endlessly repeating to the ends of the world with the occasional river or stream. At least the autumn weather was pleasant. By noon, Jamirh had had it. He was exhausted and aching after walking and running almost non-stop since they had left the jail. His ears were in a near-permanent droop, and his feet were dragging. He had been awake for over 24 hours at this point. Keeping his eyes open was becoming a challenge without the adrenaline of the chase helping out. "Hey," he started, catching her attention. We need to take a break. Hel frowned slightly. Do we? I'd like to be sure we're outside the city borders before we stop. Jamirh gestured around him at the fields. What are you hoping for? A sign? We are in the middle of nowhere. We've been in the middle of nowhere for hours. Oh, this is definitely not the middle of nowhere. Like I said, we might not even be out of the city yet, technically. We are still within walking distance of civilization, which is honestly too close for my peace of mind right now. We are still within walking distance because we have been walking, Jamirh grit out. Not much we can do about that, but keep walking, Hel declared cheerfully, though she wilted slightly at the look Jamirh shot her. Look, I'm exhausted. I feel like I've been awake for forever. I've been arrested, concussed, unconcussed, unarrested, scared nearly half to death in my own home, and dragged through the entire city and then through the old sewers. Everything hurts right now, and I feel like I'm going to pass out. Hel pursed her lips as she eyed him carefully. Maybe a short break, she conceded. A very short break. We really do need to keep moving. It won't take them long to decide we got past the blockades in the city proper. She changed direction towards a small group of trees a short distance away. Is it going to be like this the entire way to the wall? Just endless fields? Jamirh asked tiredly, but his thoughts drifted back towards the Avari and Black fields. I sincerely wish, but no, she responded dryly. We are going to avoid the cities, but we will probably pass through some towns on the way. It is going to take over a week if we have to walk the whole way there, so I'm hoping to secure some other means of transportation at some point. Not walking sounds good, Jamirh agreed as they reached the trees. He allowed himself to collapse at the foot of the nearest one. A short break, she reminded him, as she looked back the way they had come, violet eyes scanning the distance. Jamirh shut his own eyes just to rest them for a moment. The next thing he knew, Hel was shaking him awake. Come on, time to go, came the cheerful voice he was sort of coming to hate a bit. Jamirh blinked, rubbing at his eyes, and noticed that it was mid-afternoon. So, maybe 3 hours of sleep or so. He still felt horrible. And thirsty. He regretted not bringing the bottles of water. Do we have to? He whined as she pulled him to his feet. Terribly sorry, but yes, came the firm answer. Her gaze swept out over the fields again. We need to keep moving so we can stay ahead of where they are. Jamirh couldn't really argue with that, even if he wanted to in the name of more sleep. He quickly redid his ponytail to brush out the pieces of grass that had tried to invade and recapture the few ruby-colored strands that had escaped as he slept. And then they were off again, through more fields, with more trees. He wanted to ask her more about why she was doing this, but found it hard to rustle up the energy. As the sun began to set, they finally came upon a dirt road lined with sickly-looking trees and a poorly maintained wooden wire fence. Hel hummed thoughtfully, looking both ways, then declared that they would follow the road for a bit. They found apples on a few of the trees as they traveled. The apples were small, but they were able to find enough to help offset a day of walking on an empty stomach. A nearby brook provided them with something to drink. They exchanged few words. Jamirh was content to stew in his misery, and Hel seemed to realize that he was not in the mood for conversation. They continued on down the road until well into the night. Then a howl in the distance shattered the silence. Jamir's head snapped around. Wolves? He exclaimed, trying to figure out how far away they were. His hand found his key. Something like that, Hel agreed. And while she also appeared to be listening closely, Jamirh noticed she did not look concerned. She's not nearby, but we should leave the road again, I think. She? How did Hel know the wolf's gender? How does leaving the road help us in this situation? He asked as they climbed over a low stone wall into another field. She isn't hunting us and won't bother us if we come across her. However, those who are hunting us will definitely be looking along the roads. We've been following this one long enough, though I think we may have been successful in hiding our direction. I swear, if we go over that wall and on the other side are more fields, she laughed. You don't leave the city much, do you? Jamirh kicked a rock. I've never left Lyndiniam before. Ever. Oh. He could hear the frown in her voice as her ears tilted down slightly. Never? How old are you? I'd have thought people who lived in the city would at least leave it occasionally. 22. There was no... I never needed to leave. It was shitty, yeah, but it was what I knew. Jamirh sighed. There weren't any wolves running around in Blackfields, at least. He considered hell. She looked maybe late 20s, early 30s. How old are you? Why, Jamirh! She laughed teasingly. Don't you know you should never ask a lady her age? Jamirh felt himself twitch. You asked me my age? She shrugged. You are not a lady. Jamirh strangled down a growl, as well as the desire to strangle her. Why did she have to be so difficult? There was another howl. Did that one sound closer? He asked nervously, ears twitching. No. The answer was confident, but how could she be sure? It had sounded closer to Jamirh. As someone who has spent a great deal of time in the wilds of not cities, I promise you, it was not any closer. What if there's a pack? A hungry pack who are looking for a tasty Avari supper. She was walking ahead of him, and he could see her ears were definitely twitching in amusement. She is alone, she is not near us, and she has no interest in eating us. We are fine. We have very different problems to worry about. Hel looked back at him over her shoulder. Come on, a little farther, and we'll see if there is some place to shelter for a few more hours. Maybe we can find a little more food. Do you even need to eat? Jamirh asked bitterly. They could make some sort of bionic soldier like her with all those enhancements, but they couldn't solve the food problem? Wouldn't soldiers who didn't need to eat be cheaper in the long run? Who doesn't like food? Hel sounded almost offended. I love food. Could really go for some fresh shrimp right now. With pasta. Yeah, shrimp and pasta would be good. Oh, with cheese. Warm, melty cheese. He rolled his eyes, but followed her into the darkness, stars twinkling overhead. They did eventually find a small shed in the corner of a field that Hel deemed safe enough, and Jamirh once again got the chance to pass out for a few hours. He wasn't sure whether Hel was sleeping at all, and he didn't want to ask. He was beginning to think the only answers she had were answers he didn't want. They found some berries growing nearby that Hel said were safe to eat for breakfast, and then they were moving again. As they traveled, he wondered what life was going to be like after they crossed the wall. If she was right, and there was a whole not eaten by vampires civilization there, what was it like? Were they all as crazy as she was? Was it a country of mildly crazy bionic ex-soldiers and people they had randomly adopted? That seemed unlikely, but then everything he had lived through in the past day and a half felt unlikely, and that hadn't stopped it from happening. And on that note, how exactly were they going to get past the wall? He had heard it was something like 50 feet tall. Were they somehow going to climb it? With what equipment? From what he remembered about the wall, he thought they might be heading for one of the towers. Was there some secret door there only she knew about? Hel seemed to know what she was doing, but Jamirh was certain that if he asked, the answer given would be magic, instead of a logical explanation that followed the rules of the universe. Maybe to her, it was magic. Maybe she legitimately did not understand the rules by which her own abilities played, and magic was the best she could come up with. Didn't really smart people sometimes say that magic was just science we don't understand? The day passed much the same as the previous. Fields, scavenging food, avoiding people, more fields, the occasional stone wall, random wolf in the night, pass out in a mostly sheltered place. Jamirh found himself cursing Kirsten Belian more and more with each mile covered. He had had a good thing going before she completely ruined it. When he woke up the next morning, Hel had somehow acquired a pair of large-brimmed straw hats. "Wear this," she declared, plopping one on his head. "Hopefully this will help keep people from recognizing us at a glance, since we are going to hit Ardwick today." "I can't believe I'm suggesting this," Jamirh started with a sigh. "But shouldn't we just go around the town? Stick to your beloved fields?" She shot him a disappointed look. "No need to be so dramatic about the scenery. But unfortunately, no. Going around will add significant travel time, and speed is really our goal here. We need to stay in front of the search net they are probably already extending out from Lyndiniam, and going around Ardwick would work against that. So we need to go through Ardwick." As she spoke, she braided her long white ponytail and coiled it into a wide bun on top of her head, securing it with a pin she pulled from her boot, and finishing the look by placing her own hat on top. "And sometimes, even very simple disguises can deceive people who are not actively looking for you." She eyed him critically for a moment. "You may want to hide your hair under the hat, too. But the shadow from the brim does make your hair look a little more brownish than bright red." "Excellent. Let's go." Begrudgingly, he tied his own hair up into a small, high bun to fit uncomfortably under the itchy hat as they started off into the field. "If only we could dye it." "You're telling me," she laughed. "My hair would be the perfect canvas for basically anything. Have you ever tried it?" Jamirh winced at the memory. "Once. It was a very weird, very gross experience." He shuddered at the memory of the dye just sliding off his hair into the sink, like some sort of oily ink monster. It had stained his hands black thoroughly, his hair not at all. Hel nodded. "Yeah, it definitely is. Hope springs eternal, though, that one day they might make a formula that works." "I doubt humans would want us to have it," he commented dryly. "Our hair is usually the first thing they notice, and they certainly wouldn't want to accidentally think an Avari was a human." "I mean, if they miss the ears, I think that's on them," she laughed, twitching her ears in an exaggerated manner. "Besides, maybe I want to go full rainbow. That could be fun." "That isn't the direction I'd go in," he said, thinking longingly of black. Safe, solid black. A great improvement over his own gem-toned hair. Hel was probably the only Avari in the world who would want more colors. They eventually found a paved road that was actually in use and wandered into town several hours later, fields melting into houses and yards. About a mile into town was a gas station that Hel insisted they stop at. She dropped Jamirh off outside at one of the umbrella-shaded tables with a warning to keep his hat as low as possible, then went in. Jamirh eyed the area, but no one seemed to be paying attention to him at all. There was a young Avari couple at a nearby table, sharing some sort of blue beverage, but their attention seemed wholly on each other. No one else appeared to be lingering nearby. Most were just filling up their tanks and leaving, with a few going in and out of the store itself. It didn't look that busy. Content that he was safe for the moment, Jamirh switched his attention to the small vid screen broadcasting the news at the corner of the store. He couldn't hear anything, but the ticker at the bottom of the screen helpfully proclaimed, "Breaking news. Shurai Takeshi banished from Ni Fon," at the bottom of the screen as the two anchors talked to each other. Jamirh snorted, unsurprised that the human had not received the death penalty. If the murderer had been Avari, they would certainly have been put to death. He wondered fleetingly what banishment would look like, since Ni Fon was mostly large islands. As he gazed at the screen, Hel returned to the table, dropping a pair of dark sunglasses and a muffin in front of him. "Luckily, the weather is sunny enough that wearing these won't look suspicious," she chirped happily. "Do I look cool?" She struck a pose, her own sunglasses already in place, another muffin held triumphantly in one hand. She had a dark canvas bag slung over one shoulder. It looked stuffed. "I suppose," he said hesitantly, taking the glasses and putting them on. His gaze flicked back to the vid screen, where the anchors had been replaced by a picture of a pale-skinned human with choppy black hair and dark eyes, kneeling in what looked like some sort of grand hall. He looked kind of like every human from Ni Fon. Jamirh guessed that was Shurai. Another human escapes death, he mused. They sentenced the guy who killed the Duchess's daughter to banishment. They were never going to kill him, she disagreed, turning to look at the screen herself. Ni Fon has always had a really weird relationship with the assassins they cultivate. And that whole situation screams of weirdness anyway. She paused. Though to be fair, not many of those who are banished make the crossing alive. That's a lot of ocean to cross to get to safety. It's basically a death sentence disguised as not a death sentence. Will he even really be safe if he makes it? He asked curiously. Won't he be in danger from people who are angry he killed the girl? He peeled the wrapper off the muffin and began to break off chunks to pop into his mouth. Corn muffins were good. She shrugged. Safe as anywhere else, I guess. He was a silent one, and they have quite the skill set. He can take care of himself. Honestly, whether he dies in the crossing or makes it to shore somewhere, my guess would be that he disappears, and no one hears from him again. Jamirh considered the picture of the man on the screen. Why is this guy even allowed on the continent? If Ni Fon banished him for the death of one of their nobles, shouldn't he be banished from the empire as a whole? Maybe he should have paid more attention to what people had been saying about the whole mess. Hell's face twisted in a grimace. It's a little more complicated than that. The provinces, and the dukes that control them, have a lot of influence over their own laws and whatnot, even though technically the emperor has the final say. And Ni Fon especially takes advantage of their distance from the rest of the empire. They have the right to punish their criminals as they see fit, but their justice ends at their own borders. It's not like here, where Elbe, Gale, and Gallia all touch each other and so tend to act more like one state rather than three. Jamirh connects to a Gale, though. Yes, but just barely. The Gulf separates most of Jamirh from everywhere else, so they also tend to do their own thing. She turned her gaze back towards Jamirh as the picture switched to the two anchors. Even still, I imagine honest employment may be difficult for him to acquire, even if he's inclined to. I'm sure illegal employment might align more with his abilities anyway. She suddenly grinned slyly at him. They use magic, you know. The silent ones. Shinobi. Different than what I do. They try to keep their arrays in their minds rather than manifesting them, and they call them something else. But magic nonetheless. Jamirh shook his head. I don't know anything about Ni Fon, really. Just that it's a province across the Shay Sea, and they all kind of have that coloring. The image had changed to a rich-looking female human, with bright red lips and her black hair in a complicated updo, speaking into the camera. The lace and crystal dress she was wearing looked like it had cost enough to feed the entire town they were in for a year. Her dark eyes welled with tears, though none were actually falling. The Duchess, probably. Jamirh couldn't remember her name. Oh. Hell's ears drooped a bit in disappointment, but she rallied quickly. Well, they use magic. You can take my word for it. He could give her points for trying. Sure, he murmured, looking back at the screen. What's in the bag? Some food for us, water bottles, and a couple of other small things that might come in handy. It's mostly different types of granola bars, though. I hope you like granola. He shrugged. It's fine, as long as it's edible. Her eyebrows came together as she considered that statement. I suppose that gas station granola bars are, at base minimum, edible. You're the one that bought them, he pointed out. Or stole them. Do you have money? Should we be leaving quickly? The look Hell gave him was clearly affronted, her ears dropping low. I did not steal them. I bought them. Like a normal person. Jamirh just shrugged again. Hey, no shade if you did. Just want to know if we need to get out of Dodge. He eyed her carefully for a moment. Though, just out of curiosity, how did you pay for them? Did they lock you up with your card on you? He'd made it through with his key. He guessed it wasn't completely outside the realm of possibility. She glared at him, silent. I see. He laughed slightly. Whatever. Her apparently hacking the machine was the least of his worries. He looked back at the screen with vague interest. Then he noticed something that made him freeze. That looks like me, in the bottom corner. The ticker displayed the words, Wanted, Avari male, dark red hair, silver eyes, wearing... At least the anchors still looked like they were discussing the proclamation from Ni Fon. We might actually need to go. He didn't remember them taking that picture, but then he'd been pretty out of it for a good portion of that night. Hel's gaze flicked over, and her eyebrows rose in surprise before her face scrunched into a wince. Yes, that does certainly look like you. Unfortunate, but not unexpected, I guess. Definitely time to go. She stood up quickly, cramming the rest of her muffin in her mouth. He was pretty sure the garbled words she said translated into something like, I love these things. He watched the screen for a moment longer before he realized what he was waiting for. Hey, he started slowly. Why aren't you up there? Why just me? She blinked at him in surprise, swallowing her mouthful of food and turning to look at the vid screen herself. They both stared at it for a few more minutes, but Jamirh's wanted picture was replaced by more information about the banishment, not a corresponding picture of Hel. I don't know. She sounded honestly surprised. I would think I would be. We didn't exactly make it a secret that we were breaking out together. Jamirh thought back to them crashing through 2 sets of glass doors with an internal wince. No, we did not. That is pretty weird. Maybe they showed it earlier? She suggested. I've been sitting here for the past 20 minutes. The banishment has basically taken over the news, he countered. They both stared at each other. Well, she finally stated slowly, maybe this is a good thing. If they are not plastering my face all over everything, that means I'll have a little more freedom around other people. She looked troubled. Or maybe they just really care about you, since the complaint comes from the Belian family. Maybe, he agreed carefully. He wasn't quite sure what to think about that, but he also wasn't sure he liked what it could imply. As they started to head out of town, Jamirh resolved to keep a closer eye on Hel. She had been helpful so far, but overall she was a mystery to him. All he knew was that she had been in a jail cell at the same time he was, and she appeared to have multiple bionic enhancements. He didn't even know why she had been in jail. If he remembered correctly, when he had asked, she had simply responded with, I walked. What was her end goal here? Was she really trying to help him? Why? What real motive did she have to haul him over 400 miles of essentially enemy territory? He didn't know anything about her, but she had already gotten quite a bit of information about him. And that could be dangerous. Chapter 4. Leaving Ardwick was thankfully no more difficult than entering Ardwick. It was even easier, in fact. There was a bus heading north to the next town of Dales, and it was both cheap and mostly empty. It was also leaving in under half an hour, so they wouldn't have to stay in town for long. Hel bought 2 tickets from the nearby terminal, and they spent their half hour loitering nearby. They boarded as soon as they could, watching everyone around them warily while trying to pretend they weren't. Jamirh felt paranoid, and he found himself playing with his key constantly. He had to keep reminding himself not to stare at people who came too close, as that would draw their attention. But if he had seen his picture on the news, that meant there was a good chance at least some of these people had seen it too. It was hard to put his faith in a straw hat, sunglasses, and the obliviousness of everyday people, no matter what Hel said. For that matter, it was hard to put his faith in Hel herself right now. He didn't know what to think. For the entire 2.5 hours of their bus ride, Jamirh kept turning over possibilities in his mind as he watched the boring scenery pass by. What if Hel was working against him? But then, what would her motivation for that be? What did the authorities have to gain from Hel dragging him around the countryside for days before inevitably arresting him? But if she wasn't working with them, why wasn't she listed as wanted along with him? If she actually was helping him, what was her motivation for that? None of it made any sense, and by the time the bus pulled into the Dales station, all he had succeeded in was giving himself a headache as his questions chased themselves in circles. Jamirh dragged himself out of his seat, wondering if his time would have been better spent napping. It almost didn't matter what the truth was. In the end, he was still reliant on Hel to get anywhere. He was under no illusions that he would do well this far outside of the city on his own. He didn't even know if he could find his way either to the wall or back to Lyndiniam, though going back meant probably death, if he were being honest, so that was out. As they climbed down out of the bus, Jamirh touched Hel's arm to grab her attention. By any chance, did you get anything for a headache in that bag? She shook her head apologetically. No, I didn't think of it. I'm sorry. Maybe I can swing really quick into a pharmacy before we leave. They stepped out of the station. Is there anything else? Hel's voice abruptly cut out as she yanked Jamirh back into the station. What is your problem? He yelped in surprise, rubbing at his arm. We have a problem, she stated grimly. Across the street. Jamirh chanced a glance out the door and immediately saw the issue. A human woman in a gray uniform with blue and red accents was walking along the sidewalk on the other side of the street. She was armed with a saber and a pistol, and a heavily embroidered strip of fabric covered her eyes. A truth seeker. Truth seekers were high-ranking officers in the Empire's military who used all kinds of cutting-edge tech to aid them in their work, which, to Jamirh's knowledge, usually ended with someone disappearing. He didn't know how they functioned with their eyes covered, but it didn't seem to bother them at all, so there was probably more tech he just didn't know about. They were not well known for having any sort of mercy or humor, and they enforced the law rigorously when they were present. Okay, yeah, that's bad, Jamirh agreed. She's almost certainly looking for us, Hel murmured. But I think this may actually just be a stab in the dark. They do a thing, a sort of scan, when they are actively looking for someone, and she's not doing it. I would feel it. So they have probably sent out truth seekers in various directions and hoped for the best. We just got unlucky to run into one. Okay, Jamirh said slowly, choosing not to unpack that for now. How do we get around her? Truth seekers are something I have always been very happy to never deal with. Where's the bus going? Can we get out that way? Hel shook her head. The bus is going on to Norick, which is extremely out of our way. We want to aim for Sterlo, and there don't seem to be any buses heading that way for a while. Since she's not actively scanning, though, our best bet is just to let her walk away and then leave as fast as we can. Hel frowned. But even if it was a stab in the dark, I don't like that she's here. They waited in silence for a few more minutes before Hel chanced another look outside. She's leaving, she confirmed. Time to get out of here. They wasted no time in heading northwest out of the town, being sure to head in the opposite direction of the truth seeker. Neither of them fully relaxed until they had left the town and roads far behind them and were back to trekking through fields. Hel handed Jamirh a granola bar and a water bottle, and they ate lunch on the go. Just as Jamirh had resigned himself again to more of the boring scenery, he noticed the landscape was actually changing. The fields had rarely been flat, but now he started to notice that the rises and falls were becoming far more pronounced. The number of trees they were seeing also started to decline. A short time after nightfall, they reached a short stone wall, and he realized that there were no more fields, just rolling hills covered in low vegetation. They had found the moors. Let's not tackle this quite yet, Hel suggested. We are 7 or 8 hours out of town. We can take a quick break there. She indicated one sad, lonely tree by the wall. Jamirh was quick to head in that direction. Just as they reached it, a long howl cut through the silence. Jamir's eyes widened. That sounded far closer than last night. Hel frowned slightly. It did, but I'm sure it's fine. She's still not interested in eating 2 random travelers. She paused. Another howl sounded. Jamirh was certain it was coming closer.
Hel winced. Actually, now might be a good time to explain. That howl sounded really close, Jamirh nervously interrupted, ears held low. By what percentage exactly are you sure the wolves won't bother us? Well, she drawled carefully, violet eyes suddenly focused on something behind him. I am 100% certain that our howling friend is not a wolf. Jamirh froze. He very purposefully did not turn around, hand reaching up to his key. Then what is it? She didn't answer right away, eyes coming back to land on Jamirh. Have you ever heard of wargs? She finally asked, tilting her head to the side.
No.
He was pretty sure he didn't want to, either. They are kind of like wolves. Like really, really big wolves. Very fluffy. More intelligent, too. She was looking at him apologetically. That was strange. Maybe you should walk over to me. But, and I cannot stress this enough, there is no reason to panic. Oh, that was probably bad. He swallowed hard. Slowly, deliberately, he took the few steps over to Hel, then turned around. He suddenly found himself unable to breathe. It was big. White blonde fur covered it from head to toe. It was standing on 4 paws, sharp claws digging into the dirt just beyond where he had been a moment before. Its head, which was larger than his, came up to his shoulder, and he could just see a hint of what must be ridiculously large fangs. Bright green eyes with far too much intelligence for his comfort eyed him curiously from over a wolf-like snout. The beast made a soft whining sound and took a step in his direction. Jamirh scrambled back as Hel grabbed his arm, stretching out her other hand palm out towards the creature. Jerry, I am trying not to break him. Please just stay like that, Hel said desperately. Jamirh, breathe. She won't hurt you. The giant thing sat abruptly, and a thumping noise came from behind it. He realized it was the tail hitting the ground. It was wagging its tail. Jamirh felt faint. See? This is Jerry. Jerry is friendly, Hel soothed as Jamirh panicked. Jerry won't hurt us. You could even pet her. He may have imagined that the beast's gaze sharpened as it turned its attention towards Hel, but the sound of its tail beat steadily. She's actually been with us most of the way. She's who you've been hearing at night. I've been able to keep track of where the authorities have been looking based on where she's been. She's been howling to signal to me. I've even been telling you all along that she wouldn't hurt us. It made a sound that was almost like a howl, but much quieter. See, Jerry is a good girl. I was just about to tell you about her, and maybe I procrastinated a bit too long. Jamirh fainted. This whole situation has not gone well, let me tell you. As Jamirh slowly became aware of the world again, the first thing he heard was Hel's angry ranting. I'm glad you're back with us, with that truth seeker being so close, but we really could have workshopped this a little better. There was a lengthy pause. Maybe I should have, but this didn't help matters. Jamirh blinked his eyes open. He was lying on the ground by the sad tree, partially sheltered by the wall. Hel was kneeling close to his head, and the wolf thing was lying about 10 feet away, watching him. Her tail started to wag when she saw him looking at her. Jamirh! Hel's voice sounded relieved. Please don't do that again. How do you feel? Awful, he muttered. It's still here. Hel looked pained, and her ears drooped even farther than they had been. Actually, she is likely to stay with us for the rest of our journey. I don't want her running around on her own with that truth seeker so close. Privately, Jamirh thought the creature, a warg, had Hel called it, would just eat the truth seeker, but what did he know? It certainly looked big enough to end any confrontation with one chomp of its jaws. Jamirh started to push himself up. Oh, no. We are taking our break here, remember? Hel pushed him back down again. You should just lie there and rest a bit. Or I'll have Jerry sit on you. Jamirh looked at Hel with horror. Jerry's ears went flat to her head. She'd squish me, Jamirh squeaked out. Maybe not. That's a bad... Never mind. Pretend I didn't say that. Hel's ears were completely sunk at this point. She looked miserable. Please don't pass out again. Jerry snorted. Hel sent a hurt look the warg's way. Don't be like that, she muttered. She curled back against the tree. Jamirh wondered if this was how the insanity started. They stayed at the little tree for several hours. Jamirh managed to doze a bit despite the large predator lying only several feet away. It was still well before dawn when Jerry made a huffing sound and hauled herself to her feet. Yeah, we should probably get moving, Hel sighed. We have a ways to go before we reach Sturlow. She dug around in the bag before handing Jamirh a granola bar. And now, instead of fields, we have the moors. So they set out again, this time with a wolf the size of a small pony accompanying them. The warg didn't exactly follow them closely. She wandered in and out, and sometimes Jamirh could see her looking around on top of the hills quite a bit away. Their luck with the weather also broke. It started to drizzle, then rain around noon. By the time they stopped again for the night by some large rocks protruding out of the ground, everyone was wet, cold, and miserable. Even Hel didn't seem to be able to rustle up her usual cheer, and between the cold and the wet, Jamirh was barely able to rest for the duration of their stop. By the time they dragged themselves back into movement, he felt like he was actually worse off than when they had stopped. And so it was in this frame of mind that they came upon Sturlow. Sturlow was smaller than either Ardwick or Dales, and Hel seemed to be considering whether she wanted to try going around instead of through. In the end, she decided that they would try to get some sort of rain gear at one of the small stores in the town. Jerry peeled off from them when they found the road, heading farther into the moors, and Hel said they'd meet up with her later. Jamirh breathed a sigh of relief. It was still drizzling as they entered town, hats firmly in place. Hel was determined to find a convenience store quickly and then get out. Jamirh got the impression that the near encounter with the truth seeker in Dales had spooked her far more than she let on. In some ways, Sturlow reminded Jamirh of Blackfields more than anywhere else they had been since leaving Lyndiniam. The town was grungy. The roads were less maintained than in the other towns, and there were multiple buildings that looked like they needed repairs. There were barely any people out and about. The gray cast to the sky and persistent drizzle did not improve the overall look of the place. They found a small store rather quickly. Jamirh followed Hel into the store, where she found an aisle full of random outdoor gear. He looked around as she considered the products on display, regretting that his pockets were only big enough for a package of fishhooks he thought could be useful and a small spool of fishing line. They had passed a few lakes. Perhaps they could try to catch some fish? Aside from the cashier, they were the only two people in the store. Even here, there were signs of mild neglect. Finally, having made her selection, Hel brought it up to the cashier. Jamirh was wondering how exactly this was going to work when a now familiar howl echoed from somewhere outside the building. Jamirh froze. Jerry had never signaled them during the day. Where even was she? Hel didn't hesitate. We need to go now. She grabbed his arm and pulled him out the door, abandoning the ponchos on the counter, stopping abruptly as they hit the damp air outside. Not even 15 feet away, paused looking out towards the moors with a puzzled look on her face, was a truth seeker. Her head turned slowly and unerringly in their direction. Even though her eyes were covered, Jamirh could not help but feel the weight of her gaze on him. He felt a chill travel down his spine like a pulse. Ah, she said, voice distant. I see. A brilliant flash of violet light and a large circle made of lines and symbols appeared in front of Hel. It reminded Jamirh of the very small circle he had seen when she weakened the bars back in the sewer, but 5 feet across and more complex.
You don't want to do this,
Hel warned, voice dark. You can't win. Not against me. The Truth Seeker cocked her head to the side, considering.
Nothing is determined until action is taken. The Avari behind you is wanted. Give him to me.
Jamirh did not like the way she had said wanted. Everything about her was creepy. No, Hel said flatly. Something skittered across the ground towards the woman. Jamirh did not understand what happened next. It was as if a cloud of shadow suddenly erupted from around her feet in large tentacle-like shapes surrounding the Truth Seeker. Bright green eyes glittered angrily from somewhere in its depths as a portion of the shadow coalesced into the form of a woman in black, long white blonde hair in a braid. She was holding 2 narrow, slightly curved short swords, one in each hand. The Truth Seeker's head hit the ground separately from her body.
What in the actual... And we're out,
Hel interrupted him, starting to move.
The short version is, that's Jerry. What? And that was almost certainly too late, so we need to go.
Hel was running, pulling Jamirh with her. A large white blonde wolf ran with them. The few people they saw got out of their way quickly. They didn't stop running until they were well out of the town, by which point Jamirh was seriously out of breath. The past couple of days of being on the run in near constant motion with little sleep were starting to catch up with him. He nearly collapsed when Hel finally slowed to a stop, Jerry circling back to them. We can take a minute, I think, but really not much more than that. Our plan now is basically to rush our way to the wall and pray we get there before they can catch us, she sighed. Jamirh wheezed for a moment, trying to catch his breath. What was that? He finally exclaimed, staring at Jerry. She whined slightly. Hel sighed again. This is not Jerry's native form. That would be the humanoid form you saw back in the town. But it is hard for her to be out during the day. She's old enough where she can be, but not old enough to do so comfortably. Her warg form protects her from the UV rays, mostly. Hel tilted her head slightly to the side. We should probably be thankful for the rain, honestly. Why didn't you tell me this earlier? Jamirh was flabbergasted. Hel winced. I've been trying not to overwhelm you. You don't really seem to take to new things well. I thought we could explain more once we were safely on the other side of the wall. Jerry whined, clearly unhappy. Jerry disagrees. She thinks I've been doing you a disservice. Jamirh stared at her, something niggling at the back of his mind. He poked at it a bit and came to a realization. Were you the woman from the casino? Jerry nodded.
Jerry is the one who first alerted me that you were in trouble, actually. She didn't really believe that Belian would let you go so easily.
Her eyes flickered down briefly, then back up. We should get moving. We can talk and walk. But if you killed the Truth Seeker, doesn't that buy us time, not lose it? It didn't even look like Jerry had any problems killing her. So why can't you just do the same if any more come after us? Jamirh was confused. How did she do that anyway? Hel shook her head. As soon as she saw you, that Truth Seeker alerted every other Truth Seeker as to where you were. They are all connected. Unfortunately, that means that the military now knows where we are and can make a very good guess where we are headed. And while Jerry made it look easy, that was not an easy or safe thing to pull off. Jerry's tail wagged happily, as her mouth opened in something like the dog version of a grin. It only worked because, for a moment, the Truth Seeker's attention was entirely on the two of us, which was an indicator she might not have been very good at her job. She heard Jerry's warning and probably should have guessed there was a third threat, even if she didn't know who or what it was. What was the purple thing? He asked. A shield array. I am very good at them. A hint of pride entered Hel's voice. What is an array? That answer had cleared up nothing. She sighed. I am still not sure that now is the time for this, but the short version is that an array is the catalyst for most spell casting. Choose glyphs based on the effect you want, arrange them into the circle, add the bridging lines to balance them, supply the array with energy, and there you go, a functioning spell. The bigger the array, the more glyphs you can use, the more complex the spell, and the more energy it takes. Jamirh's head hurt. I didn't see any magic circles when Jerry did whatever it was she did. Jerry's shadow abilities are innate, so she doesn't need an array to use them. Same with her ability to shift into a warg. I see. He did not see. How did anyone ever keep any of this straight? None of this made sense to him. They lapsed into silence as Jamirh thought that over. If it were true, that would mean that a fundamental belief of the Empire, that magic had died out long ago, was false. Supposedly, Avari had been better at magic than humans. Was that why? Otherwise, why try to suppress magic? The little group trudged along. As they crested a hill near dusk, Jamirh noticed something strange about the landscape in the distance. It looked like the land had been flattened. What is that? He asked, squinting ahead. That is the waste. Or the start of it, at least, Hel answered. It means we are almost there. The waste stretches about 30 miles out from the wall. It looks unnatural, Jamirh commented. It is. It was created when the wall was. Through some sort of magical sacrifice ritual. He was pretty sure he was remembering that correctly. Yes, there is great power in such things, she said softly, ears lowering. Jerry whimpered. I know, Hel murmured softly. I sense it too. Jamirh frowned. Sense what? We are being followed, Hel sighed. She looked at Jerry. You need to get him to the wall. Jerry's form suddenly shifted into shadow, and when it receded, it was the human woman who stood there. She glanced quickly at Jamirh, who was staring at her in surprise, then turned her attention back to Hel. That is an awful idea, and you've had some pretty choice ones on this little jaunt. It will catch up to us long before we can reach the wall otherwise. I can buy you the time you need. Besides, I wonder, can I win like this, do you think? Hel's voice was wry. Your body won't be able to handle the stress of that. Anders said, I think it'll be okay. Hel shrugged. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? Jerry stared at her. Jamirh was totally lost. Hel smiled at him. Well, it's been fun. 5 days of intense bonding while on the run from evil people makes us friends at least, right? Does it? He asked weakly, as Jerry slowly put her face in her hands. I think it does, she chirped cheerfully, ears twitching up. Think of all the good times we had. You're leaving? He asked, suddenly realizing what was happening. He gripped his key tightly. He hadn't known her very long at all. He hadn't thought it would hit like this. This was why he stuck to himself. Well, I'm staying, to be more precise. You two are leaving. The country, if all goes well. She smiled at him. Don't worry. I'll catch up when I can. Tell Vlad I was right. Who? Don't worry, I know who he is, Jerry sighed. She looked at Hel. Are you sure? Hel met her gaze evenly. Something in her eyes gleamed. Positive. Jerry looked down for a long minute. When she looked up again, she nodded firmly at Hel, then touched Jamirh's arm. Come on, we still have a ways to go. But Hel is, for better or worse, an adult who makes her own, often very bad, decisions. Hel sat down. I'm just going to wait here. You two go. If you stay here for much longer, there won't be any point to this. Jamirh stared at her, conflicted. For all that she had been an annoying, confusing, and miserable pain for the vast majority of their journey, she had been there. Even though he had his doubts about her, doubts that were beginning to look more and more foolish, she had still tried to help. Maybe in a completely nonsensical way, but the intent had been there. Even now, she was trying to help get him to safety by putting herself in danger. And now she was leaving. Everyone left. Jerry tugged on his arm. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess we are friends." She beamed at him. He followed Jerry into the waste. It was just before dawn when the wall came into view. It was tall and gray. A large round tower stuck out of it. "That is the Tower of Morden. It is where we need to go," Jerry commented. It was the first either of them had spoken since leaving Hell behind. Morden was the mage who died in this spot. The towers are all named for their mages. Jamirh hummed in acknowledgement. "I'm going to shift back into warg form before the sun comes up," she continued. "But don't worry. I'll still be able to guide you, and I'll still be able to understand anything you say. Once we are in the tower, I can shift back, and we can talk about our next steps." He nodded. "Don't worry," she exclaimed suddenly. "Hell may seem a little flighty, and have no idea how people should interact with each other, but she is a very capable mage. She'll be fine. She knows how to cross the wall. She'll follow in her own time." It sounded a bit forced. Jamirh appreciated that Jerry was trying to make him feel better, but nothing about this whole situation was sitting well with him anymore. "We should get going then," he suggested tiredly. Maybe they would be able to sleep for longer than a few hours at a time once they crossed. That would be a positive. He stared at the distant tower numbly, rubbing his key between his fingers. When he glanced back at Jerry, she was already a warg. She woofed softly at him and nudged him towards the wall. Yeah, I'm going," he sighed, forcing his aching body to move. "Colonel Road, sir." A woman in full military dress with short, wavy black hair approached the colonel as he eyed the large crater. "Report, Major." Avon Road ran a hand over his close-shaven brown hair, wondering what the hell had happened here to cause this much destruction. He hoped there had been some sort of recording equipment somewhere that might have picked up the event. "We have completely lost our asset. It is basically in pieces scattered over a 50-square-foot area." Well, that was unfortunate. "Farah thinks we might be able to reclaim some of the implants, but I personally don't hold out much hope for that." Major Cole adjusted her glasses as she continued. "And the likelihood of the criminal having successfully crossed the wall is high by now. We've probably lost him." Lovely. Belian was going to throw a fit. "However," she continued, "we did get one of theirs." Rode perked up at that. "Really?" "Yes. We found her unconscious in the middle of that." She indicated the crater. He stroked his goatee, considering. They had never managed to capture one of Romani's agents before. Something might yet be gained from this, even though it came with an expensive loss. "Secure the prisoner," he finally commanded. "Prepare transport to the Sharv facility. If she was capable of this, then we take no chances. Have a truth seeker monitor her at all times. Keep her unconscious." "Yes, sir." Cole snapped a smart salute. "Let us see what this brings," he mused, eyeing the crater one last time. "Perhaps this will be the edge we need."